Paranoia can be one of the most dangerous feelings to have. It can turn family and friends against each other and cause even the most sound-minded person to go insane, as they begin to worry about even the smallest of things. Does everyone hate me? Is my door locked? Will my PNG of a monkey make me rich in the future? Capturing the true nature and consequences of this feeling in media has been done to varying degrees of success, but there was one man who perfectly demonstrated how paranoia can completely break down a well-organised and functioning system, and that man was John Carpenter, with his 1982 film, The Thing. The Thing depicts a team of American researchers in Antarctica who come into contact with an alien that has the ability to absorb and assimilate its prey. Not only this, but it can also infect other life forms with its DNA, turning any living thing exposed to this DNA into an extension of itself. Once the team realises the abilities of the alien and that any of them could be infected, they begin to show their true colours, turning on each other and becoming increasingly distrustful and aggressive. Soon it's not just the alien they have to worry about, but themselves too. Despite the brilliance of The Thing, on its release, small-brained critics and audience members ripped the film to shreds, calling it an abomination and complaining that it was nothing like E.T., which released a little earlier that same year, because as we all know, E.T. was the first sci-fi film ever made, right before Star Wars, Alien, and 2001: A Space Odyssey. It wasn't until its home release that the brilliance of The Thing was finally recognised, as it gained a cult following, eventually gaining worldwide praise many years after its release. It's also known for its amazing practical effects created by Rob Bottin, as well as its fantastic casting choices with the likes of Kurt Russell, Keith David, and Wilfred Brimley.
Diabetes.
Like any successful horror franchise, it was milked for all it was worth many years later, with the most known project being the 2011 prequel titled The Thing. That's a bit confusing, which was rightfully met with harsh criticism due to reusing key plot points from the first film and its lack of practical effects. There's also another popular route that horror franchises take to tap into an even bigger audience, and that's video games. That's why in 2002, Computer Artworks, a small development team, created The Thing. Jeez, why is everything in this series just called The Thing? Couldn't they have just given them secondary titles? Or just put like a 2 next to it maybe? Anyway, The Thing, the game, is a third-person survival horror squad shooter based after the events of the original film that puts you in the shoes of Captain Blake, who becomes entangled in the Thing's shenanigans after being ordered to investigate the wrecked American outpost from the first film. Like the alien life form itself, The Thing, the game, tries to imitate many of the ideas introduced in the 1982 horror icon. Despite being more focused on delivering action rather than full-on suspense like the film, the game does still incorporate many characteristics from the film that made it scary. Like the film, the game gives you major trust issues as you navigate the many different locations in the Arctic, whilst trying to determine who is human and who ain't. Kind of like Among Us, but instead of throwing your buddies out of the airlock, you light them on fire. The game has a lot of unique mechanics that were very ambitious for 2002, and it's these features that helped it stay relevant during a time when big horror giants were making the rounds that same year. In fact, I was shocked to find out that the game sold incredibly well, as I thought it was one of those obscure games that no one really knew about, besides die-hard fans and anyone who stumbled upon a copy in a charity shop. Despite its attempts at implementing things that made the film it's based off so special, there are a lot of issues that drag its overall quality down. That's not to say that I don't like the game, because I do like parts of it. I thought it would be an interesting topic for a video. I specifically want to talk about how strange it is that we never got to see a potential sequel or even a remake of this game, as with the right team behind it, it could be one of the greatest horror video games of all time. There was in fact a planned sequel to the game that was in early stages, but it was cancelled in late 2003. It sucks to think that we could have got a more fleshed out and expanded version of this game, and I don't know why a property like this isn't at the top of any developer's list. I mean, they made a Killer Clowns from Outer Space game. Who even asked for that? The Thing deserves a proper remake, or even just a brand new game that truly captures the feeling of the first film. Once again taking place in the Antarctic, The Thing, the game, expands the world of the film, showing us that the infection of the Thing has grown further than just the Norwegian and American bases we saw in the 1982 movie, and because everyone in the movie died, well, almost everyone, we are introduced to a whole new set of characters and non-characters, which will make sense later. The opening cutscene sets a high standard for the game, as we are shown quite an eerie scene of a guy calling out for his friend in a dimly lit kitchen. He then finds his friend injured on the floor, although to be fair, it doesn't sound like he's in too much pain. Before he can help his friend, however, he is attacked by a Thing creature. Before we see it attack his friend, however, the camera feed cuts. I guess whatever they were saying in Norwegian was pretty funny. Fair play to the developers, because this is a great way to open a creepy sci-fi survival horror game. After this, we are shown a group of soldiers being dropped off at the American base from the 1982 movie, and it's here that we are introduced to the protagonist of the game, Captain Blake, the most generic badass, one-liner spewing, anger issues suffering protagonist since Shadow the Hedgehog. The narrative in the movie is very small scale, taking place primarily in one location, the American research base, centered around a small group of characters and their struggle for survival, which eventually evolves into a few survivors banding together to save the world. Whereas the game takes on a more traditional action narrative. The story starts out as Blake recording information for his boss Whitley on what happened at the American outpost, but this trip soon becomes his secondary priority, however, as he receives a distress signal from Alpha Team's leader Pierce, who is investigating the Norwegian outpost. After Blake reaches the outpost and realizes that most of his teammates are either dead or aliens, he tries his best to escape, recruiting anyone who can fight to help him. After he finds a laboratory hidden under the ice belonging to Gen Inc., a generic evil corporation wanting to do experiments on the Thing, and discovering that his boss Whitley is also in cahoots with Gen Inc., he works to put an end to their shady experiments before Whitley can unleash the Thing virus onto the world. The Gen in Gen Inc. must mean generic, because the Thing the game has one of the most generic stories you will ever find in a video game. The only thing I really took away from the story is the fact that every character in the game is really stupid. Blake throughout the game comes across as an arrogant bellend, talking to most of his soldiers like trash, and saying one-liners left and right, trying to come across as cool as MacReady, which he never does.
Now I'm gonna show you what I already know.
On top of this, he constantly makes stupid decisions, like when he thinks running at Whitley with 100 armed soldiers aiming at him is a good idea. Speaking of Whitley, he's a pretty incompetent person himself. This man willingly injected himself with the Thing virus in order to cure his cancer. What? It's hinted that Blake is immune to the virus, so if that's the case, and you plan on releasing the Thing into the atmosphere, ensuring complete global saturation, then why not just kill him so there's a lower chance of actually finding a cure? Characters in the film are conveyed in a way that makes them feel real. The interactions with each other is what sells the whole premise of the movie. Their initial friendship and light-hearted banter gradually decaying and turning into hate and distrust as the uncertainty of who is and who isn't human begins to take over. It's unfortunate that the characters in the game aren't as good as they were in the film. In fact, there aren't many characters in this game that can actually be described as characters, as most of them can just be described as props. The game feels the need to cap itself off with a helicopter segment, which reveals that MacReady survived the events of the film, probably the only memorable thing from the game. I can't even remember the name of the main guy. What was it, Dave? To be fair, the story for a game like this isn't really important, so I wouldn't mind a new Thing game focusing on the mechanics rather than the story. Like a shape-shifting alien life form that has absorbed countless other species, this game lacks an identity. It takes bits and pieces from a vast range of video game genres, and although it was definitely ambitious for the time, the game never feels like it reaches the potential with what are on paper complex and creative mechanics. You will notice that the game doubles down on the wrong genre far too often. Is it a survival horror? For the first couple of missions, yeah, it is. The beginning of the Thing, the game, is when it's at its strongest, as this is when it embraces the horror aspect of the franchise the most effectively. The first part of the game creates a sense of dread and anxiety within you, as like in the film, it slowly builds up to the initial reveal of the Thing creatures. This part of the game is actually atmospheric and suspenseful, catching you off guard with jump scares and audio stingers. This got me hyped for the rest of the game, as after all, The Thing is a renowned horror film, so the game has to be mostly horror themed, right? You would expect the game to centre around survival horror mechanics, which it does to a degree, as you have to scavenge for healing items, ammo, and other tools you will need to help you out. But what the game prides itself on above all else is the squad mechanic. Despite Blake thinking he's the biggest badass around, he can't do it all on his own. This is where those non-character NPCs come into play. Many of the NPCs you encounter throughout the game are able to join your party and help you fight the Thing creatures you come into contact with. They can be given weapons and healing items to keep them in the fight. These NPCs come in 3 different flavours: medics, soldiers, and engineers. Medics carry an infinite amount of health packs in their arses, which makes them a valuable ally during the tougher parts of the game, where taking damage becomes unavoidable. Soldiers utilise the weapons you give them more effectively, using less ammo than the other two classes, and they are also a lot braver, which is another mechanic I will get into later. Without a doubt though, the most important NPCs in the game are the engineers, because without these guys, you literally can't progress through the game. During certain parts of the game, specific doors can only be opened by repairing junction boxes, and although Blake is able to fix simple junction boxes, the advanced ones, i.e. the ones that usually let you progress through the level, can only be fixed by engineers. This can be really annoying at times, as it means that if your engineer dies, you will have to either restart the level or start from your last save. A big part of the squad mechanic is the trust system implemented into each individual NPC. When encountering NPC characters, some of them will just willingly join you, allowing you to have them follow Blake through the level. However, most of them you encounter will be cautious to trust you right away, given the fact that there are shape-shifting aliens on the loose, so you will need to gain their trust before you can have them in your party. Trust can usually be gained by giving them a weapon, health, or simply killing thing monsters in the area. As easy as trust is to gain, it's also just as easy to lose, as if your squad thinks you're acting a bit No, don't say it, don't say it, don't say it, don't say it. They will start to doubt your intentions. This usually happens when you shoot them, avoid killing enemies, or recommend watching the prequel on a movie night. Another big mechanic of NPCs themselves is the fear system. Like I've already mentioned, some NPCs are unwilling to follow you at first, believing you could be a thing, but even once you gain their trust, the fear of what lies ahead can sometimes be too much for them to handle. For the time it was released, this mechanic was very innovative, as NPCs would react to enemies and the environment in different ways. If a teammate sees something they don't like, such as a dead body, a grotesque creature, or the poor CGI from the Thing prequel, they will start to lose it. The level of fear an NPC has will affect their actions in-game, but the most horrific thing I saw was definitely watching this man piss his pants. The most memorable mechanic in the game by far is the infection mechanic. As we all know from the film, anyone and everyone can be infected, including your own squad mates, and that's where blood testing kits come into play. Given the nature of the Thing creature, it's no surprise that your very own squad members can be infected. Like how MacReady learned in the film, the game allows you to test NPCs' blood to see if they are infected or not. Sounds like they're really overpowered, but these testing kits are pretty rare and aren't really that useful when you realise that most of the NPCs are forced to become infected at scripted events. There is no doubt that there was hard work and passion put into the many intricacies of the Thing, the game, but computer artworks really bit off more than they could chew. You can't knock it for trying, as the mechanics make it an interesting shooter for a time, but its charm starts to fade when you realise just how inconsistent it is. Initially, the developers wanted to make it so your squad could follow you to the end of the game if you managed to keep them alive. However, they soon realised how hard it would be, with the lead game designer Andrew Curtis stating, "That was of course very naive, as it caused huge problems with the squad command menu, and dynamically balancing the encounters and resources required for the NPC. Even ignoring this setback, the squad command system itself was very lackluster, as there are very few instances where you can have a full squad, as there aren't enough NPCs to fill it in every level. For about 60% of the game you will be by yourself until you meet an engineer you need to fix a door. It seems like the devs were attempting to strike a balance of having the player be alone and with a squad, as you can't really get scared by an alien when you have a bunch of friends with guns, so they thought having you be alone at certain points could help balance the scariness, but instead it just leaves the experience feeling average. It is also pretty disappointing that the NPC characters didn't have much in terms of personality, although it was great to see surprise cameos from Captain Price and Wilson Fisk.
When I was a boy.
If we are ever going to get a new Thing game, it would be great to see these elements from the 2002 game get tweaked and improved, as the ideas are there, but the execution just wasn't. Although it was easy for me to praise the more ambitious mechanics, standard gameplay genuinely made me so angry I contemplated not finishing this game. It really is that bad at times. The game just seems to get so many of the basic things necessary for a horror shooter to work wrong. A big problem you begin to notice after the first couple of levels is the lack of interesting enemy variety. People love the classic 1982 film because of how creative the creature designs are. Each incarnation of the monster had something unique about it that was able to make you sick to your stomach every single time. And I get that the game can't have a unique monster design for every single enemy, because that would take forever, and games always reuse enemies. The problem I have with the enemies is that it feels like the game is oversaturated with the tiniest, most uninteresting type of enemies, this being the scuttlers. At first, they are, as you would expect, pretty creepy and entertaining to fight against, as they swarm the player in large numbers, shrieking and gnawing at your ankles. There's nothing wrong with having small, weak enemies that act as a way to make you feel overwhelmed. However, imagine if for the most part, flood infection forms were the only enemies you fought in Halo, if wretches were the only enemies you fought in Gears of War, or if Goombas were the only things you could step on in Mario. That's exactly how it feels in this game. The more interesting enemies like the dog forms or the walkers rarely get encountered, and I can't help but feel that perhaps the game would have benefited a lot more if it removed a lot of the segments where you fight these little shits, and instead added more of the tougher enemies into the mix. As well as having the cooler designs, the bigger enemies are also more interesting to fight, as they require a two-stage attack in order to kill them. They must first be weakened by gunfire before you can use your flamethrower to finish them off. Yes, it's not movie accurate, but it means that you can experiment with the variety of guns available to you, although as you will find out, some of them work better than others. The shotgun in this game might just be one of the most unreliable weapons I have ever used in a game, as sometimes it refuses to shoot when you hold down the trigger, and when it does eventually shoot, it lets out several rapid bursts, almost as if you have to charge it up. But where the gameplay really loses the plot is during boss fights. This game has some of the most unfair, unethical, good boss fights I have ever had the displeasure of participating in. They're so broken and needlessly hard that the only way you can beat them without scalping yourself is to cheese the game's AI. Probably not great boss fights if you have to hide in a corner throwing grenades, or hide underneath the boss so it can't hit you, but at least these bosses had cool designs, and that can be said for most of the enemies in the game. Yes, even the little dicks that bite your toes. But the biggest offence this game committed was having you fight human enemies. Nothing is more boring in a game about freaky aliens than having to fight generic human enemies, and these guys are the definition of generic army soldiers. Human enemies can be interesting if given proper context as to why you are fighting them, like the human enemies in Alien Isolation. They've turned into these crazy, distrustful murderers, and enemies like this would be perfect in a Thing game, as it would match the tension and distrust present in the film better than having you fight army soldiers for no reason. Choices made when designing this game leave you scratching your head, especially during the last third of the game, as the levels seem like they were built to be the most rage-inducing levels available to play in any video game. Seriously, with that staircase level alone, you'd think they were going for the world record attempt of the most unplayable level. I'm sick and tired of seeing every other horror film franchise get so much love in the video game industry, whilst this absolute masterpiece and potential video game goldmine is just forgotten about. For it to work though, it needs to be a more focused experience. For them to maximise its effectiveness, it would definitely work best as an open world type of game, as this would make it easier for them to not include scripted events. With the advancements in gaming software and in the right hands, we could see a fully realised version of the game that computer artworks set out to create, without all the bad additions to the game. Keeping your squad alive and interacting with NPCs that may or may not be infected would make for so many tense moments, and would feel like a truly faithful game adaptation. Given how good a lot of the Thing designs are already in this game, today's graphical potential could make these beasts look even more disgusting and weird. Never have I wanted a game more in my life. Well, maybe except a Rat Simulator 2, but a Thing remake is a close second.